Kristine Werner Ozug is a member of the RealTalk MS team. And so let me welcome you in front of the camera for a change.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, as someone who's living with MS, Kristine, what were your impressions of the 2025 ACTRIMS Forum?
The ACTRIMS Forum was a wonderful experience. It's quite different than ACTRIMS. ACTRIMS is about 10,000 attendees. ACTRIMS is about 1,800. So it's a much smaller conference in attendance, but it's more manageable in that it's a single track. It's not multiple tracks. Everybody is in one room at the same time, listening to the same information, and everyone is more accessible. So you get to reconnect with people that you know, and you get to make new connections. And the theme of this year's conference was making connections. And I don't know about you, but I found that much easier to do at ACTRIMS because of the smaller attendance, the way the conference is formed.
I should probably explain to our viewers that at ACTRIMS, which is the European Committee for Treatment and Research in MS, and that is the largest MS research conference in the world, as Kristine mentioned, there are multiple tracks. So there are many different presentations taking place at the same time. And invariably, you have a conference center with people frantically moving from one place to another to catch that next presentation. And so there is this heightened energy that, as I say, can be a little frantic sometimes and a little crazy. And it is hard to stop and take a breath and actually talk to somebody until after all the presentations are over for the day. I think ACTRIMS, you're right. I think everybody is more accessible because people aren't crazed about where they have to be in 5 minutes.
Yes, and we were fortunate enough to be able to see some of the clinician scientists and scientists we had connected with at ACTRIMS in the fall. And we were very fortunate to get to talk to some new ones that we hadn't met before. So I was very honored to be able to do that. And as you said, in the hall, we had more time to hang out and say hi to people and reconnect with them. And it was nice for me because I got to meet so many different people that I had only heard about or read their work. And then I got to put faces with names. And that was really exciting for me.
So, what do you think you learned at this year's ACTRIMS Forum?
The research presented was so new. It was not a repeat of ACTRIMS. So there were a few things that stood out to me. We learned about the updated McDonald's criteria at ACTRIMS, but they took it a step further here and talked about, okay, now how do we apply that? How do we apply some of the updated criteria? So there was some research and presentation and talk about the new imaging biomarkers, such as the paramagnetic rim lesions or PRLs or pearls, as they're called, as well as central vein sign, or you'll see that in literature as CVS. And what's important about these imaging biomarkers is that this can make for a more accurate diagnosis and a earlier diagnosis for people with suspected missile, or those cases where clinicians may be not quite sure if somebody has MS. And there's new imaging sequences that can be used to identify these imaging biomarkers. In some cases, you can get a sequence to see central vein sign where you can get imaging that shows the vessels, and then you can lay that on top of the MRI images so you can see the lesion that may be forming on blood vessels to show clearly if those lesions have central vein sign, which is a hallmark for an MS lesion. So to me, that was very interesting and important for people with suspected MS, because as we know, the earlier you get a diagnosis, the faster you get on a DMT, and that makes for much better outcomes.
I'm wondering if you have a particular takeaway from this conference that kind of stood out to you.
My favorite presentation that I was not anticipating was from Professor Heinz Wendell. And you attended this one with me, and it was a panel of talks about AI and machine learning. And all of the talks were really interesting, but Professor Wendell's was about the application of using machine learning and applying a large amount of data, thousands and thousands of patients and their data and from clinical trials, and inputting it in to machine learning to see what patterns could come out of that. And what they identified goes along with some of this work that you all have been talking about for the past year or so, which is what is missed really as far as the pathology and the biology and redefining MS as a spectrum. And Professor Wendell used his data out of this to support his theory in a debate about, is MS one disease and a spectrum rather than different subtypes? And his data showed, and it needs to be verified still, that the machine learning identified 3 different immunological subtypes of MS. And this can lead to more personalized medicine for people.
Well, that's funny. I think your favorite presentation was also my favorite presentation. And I think that was true for a lot of the people sitting in the room, frankly. It was a very compelling presentation. Professor Wendell's research is very thorough. And I think it's going to really contribute to the discussion that's been ongoing over the past years, you pointed out, about coming up with better ways to describe MS. Better in the sense that science has learned so much more than we knew in 1993 when the course descriptors, primary progressive, secondary progressive, relapsing remitting, when they were first formed. So they've been updated already, and I think it's time to update again, perhaps with more descriptive descriptors. In other words, descriptions that speak to the biology, the pathology that you just referenced, as opposed to how someone appears, which is what today's course descriptors are about, clinical presentation. Science has taken us a lot further in terms of understanding what's going on in the central nervous system with someone who has MS. And as a result, I think we'll see course descriptors that reflect that kind of information. And as you pointed out, then allow clinicians to provide treatment for the specific things that are happening biologically in that individual, which could be very different from another person who's in that waiting room waiting to see that same neurologist next. So it's an exciting time. And I agree with you. I think Professor Wendell's presentation was really on the mark. I want to change gears a little bit because I should mention, full transparency, you and I actually had a chance to reconnect as members of the National MS Society's Community Review of MS Research Committee. And that started conversations that led to you becoming part of the team here at RealTalk MS. We often talk about the importance of the patient voice in MS research. I certainly mention it very regularly. You and I have conversations about it, but I think it's worth exploring a little bit. Why is including the patient voice in research so important?
We all share a lived experience with MS, whether it's living with, whether it's caring for someone with them. If you've had a family member affected by MS. And clinicians, scientists are starting to understand that although they have hypotheses and research questions that they want to answer, sometimes it's necessary to ask people like you and me, does this research make sense for the community? Is the way we're designing a study perhaps make sense? Is it going to be overly burdensome for somebody? Are the number of visits in a study realistic? Are there too many expectations being placed on somebody living with MS? Is somebody going to be willing to participate? And these are things I think in the past that the people designing the research weren't really even thinking about. But this is changing, and having our voice in the design sometimes up front, or if it's reviewing a response to an RFA, perhaps an application that they're putting in for research and giving feedback on that, is starting to be valued in the scientific community. And sometimes we can even propose research questions that we think might be valuable for studies. I think it's really important to be educated in the science, educated in the disease process, and to be able to give valuable feedback to the researchers. You don't have to be a scientist per se, but understand what it is that they're trying to study and give your lived experience perspective, but also give your experience within your community to try to represent the community as a whole, because it affects all of us.
So, how can someone living with MS or affected by MS get involved in research?
I get asked this question a lot, and I started getting involved in research by joining I Conquer MS, for example, and doing their survey. They have your data has power. I do NARCOMs, also do surveys. And again, your data has power. And your symptoms, the DMTs you're on, because that data over time is used in research studies. I Conquer MS sends different opportunities to give your feedback as somebody living with MS or caring for someone with them, to have a voice in different studies. You can find out more and apply to the Community Review of MS Research Committee at the MS Society. PCORI has opportunities as well for different studies. There's organizations that send survey and study opportunities out. There's one called Rare Patient Voice you can sign up for. Some of these have compensation even for your time. Getting involved in research, there's lots of different ways. You can do it from home by simply filling out surveys. The MS Society also has research opportunities they send out and post all the time. A lot of them are surveys. Some of them are studies that you actually participate in. Centers have studies that you can participate in. And sometimes people think of research as clinical trials. And actually, that's a very small percentage of research in MS. We have all sorts of types of research that go on for quality of life, wellness, exercise. One of the advisory committees you and I serve on is about pain.
To a point you made earlier, I heard you talk about not only can you provide data, but there are some opportunities to pose research questions. And one of the places you can do that is at I Conquer MS. They have added a terrific part to their website called Our Questions Have Power. And so it's an opportunity for someone to pose a research question. Other people offer an opinion, a point of view on it. Researchers see those questions, and it's a great way to actually start something that seems to make sense to you and find out how far you can carry it forward. So, all good suggestions. I want to ask you the same question that I asked several of the MS experts that we interviewed at ACTRIMS Forum. What do you see in MS research today that has you excited?
Yes, and I got to listen to their answers, and it's the same thing that excites them, which is we're making progress in understanding MS progression. And I feel like we're also making progress in understanding nerve repair and neuroprotection. And that's what really excited me about Dr. Mika Simmons and winning the Brancic Prize this year. He studied myelin and laid the groundwork for other researchers to continue studying myelin, and his work is continuing on understanding myelin and why it fails to repair, and also looking at neuroprotection and the role that glia play in the brain about neuroprotection. I'm very excited about the work his lab is doing. I think some of the areas like Professor Wendell's presentation of understanding the biology and pathology more of MS as a disease spectrum, if you will. And I think that's going to help us, like we talked about, lead to more personalized treatment, targeted treatment for people. I also think the McDonald criteria that was just updated is going to help people get diagnosed earlier. And the imaging biomarkers excite me. I'm a little bit of a imaging geek, and I'm very interested in the research being done on pearls or paramagnetic rim lesions and iron rim lesions. The research being studied on different types of lesions can lead us to understand more about the disease pathology and progression and neuro repair and neuroprotection. Those are a few things I'm excited about.
Kristine Werner Ozug, I want to thank you for sharing your perspective on both the importance of the patient voice in MS research and on the 2025 ACTRIMS Forum.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.